Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Gibbons' bill seeks to amend only one element of the abortion NI regulations, 7(1)(b), to remove or repeal the regulation which allows termination of pregnancy up to term in cases of severe fetal impairment. Can I therefore assume that, as the bill does not attempt to address any other elements of the abortion legislation, in particular fetal abnormalities, that the proponent of the bill accepts these types of cases? And I say accept rather than agree, because I do understand the member's personal view on the issue more generally. I would say that there does seem to be much focus on the debate on the interpretation of Regulation 7, in that it mirrors the law in the rest of GB, which allows abortion up to term for conditions such as Down syndrome, cleft palate, club foot. But does it have to? Because I cannot see anywhere that suggests that Northern Ireland cannot develop its own interpretation, especially as the GB interpretation is at this point outdated, was interpreted at a point when there was less information, and is not reflective of views in the UK today. And to be fair, I think it does suggest that people with these specific conditions cannot lead fulsome lives, which is entirely wrong. I have a nephew who had quite severe club foot, and at this stage he's now 11 years old and can run rings around me. He has a fulsome life. But what I would point to is that maybe our focus needs to be on interpretation rather than legislation. I do have concerns about this particular bill, that in some cases, severe cases, and I don't mean Down syndrome, I don't mean club foot, I mean severe cases of fetal impairment that may be a reasonable medical choice for parents. And I'm not an expert, I don't think any member of this Assembly is, but I'm sure there are examples of severe fetal impairment where most of us would accept, not necessarily agree, with the choice. And if I recall the discussion around fetal abnormalities in 2016, some did not agree or accept it as a reason then, but interestingly, it's those who are now inadvertently accepting it now. And that's not a criticism. Opinions change and more information becomes available. But I do think it's a fundamental difficulty of this debate. And further, I believe definitions of both severe fetal impairment and fetal abnormality are ambiguous and subject to interpretation. It remains a point of debate about fetal abnormalities, and I don't intend to cause distress in asking, at what point is it fatal? Surely, shortly after birth, or within 28 days, as it's defined in the Republic of Ireland. I have a constituent who was diagnosed with a fetal abnormality, and she chose to carry that child to term. She gave birth. The baby was beautiful, as all babies are, but was severely disabled, and she died at 13 days old. Is this experience of severe fetal impairment or fetal abnormality? It seems that fetal impairment as a term has developed because of the uncertainty around the definition of fetal abnormality. Poor guidance and interpretation meant that doctors do not want to be responsible for these decisions, and that was government's fault. I think Mr Lunn pointed to this in saying that people don't want to make a decision around this, so they want to keep it as loose as severe fetal impairment, so that they will not potentially have a lawsuit against them. Maybe that's something that we need to consider about protecting doctors, particularly if we are still content to leave the fetal abnormality within the legislation. Mr Speaker, I do not judge the choices of parents in these circumstances, because I have compassion to know that the decision to terminate is probably the most difficult decision they will take, and I will never undermine anyone for saying that it is less than that. Another constituent had a diagnosis of fetal abnormality, and she very much wanted the baby to give her son a brother or sister. And upon diagnosis, she treated it almost like a miscarriage and assumed that the health service in Northern Ireland would help her. She was wrong. She journeyed to England for an abortion. And she told me that she felt so much guilt, but equally, she also knew the joy of being pregnant and how people responded to her as a pregnant woman, her pregnant belly, her glow. And understandably, she did not want to spend 10 weeks explaining why her feelings did not match theirs. Rather than provide her with health care and support at the time, Government's failure scarred her. And my biggest concern with this legislation is that we're going to create a similar situation again. Because it's not about Down syndrome, it's not about cleft palate or club foot, it's about severe impairment. And depending on the doctor, depending on their subjective diagnosis, whether they diagnose as severe or fatal, you might potentially accept their decision. So what is the issue here? It's interpretation. And I do have concerns about the abortion law as it stands. My biggest concern actually comes from abortions up to term for a range of circumstances. And if this bill has the scope to address this element, then I might consider supporting it. So I would be keen to hear what the proponent says in relation to this. Because term limits require legislative change. Interpretation of legislation doesn't. The proponent has leaned heavily on disability discrimination. And as members, you will know that constituents will regularly come to us and tell us that they have suffered discrimination. And advising them, I refer them to Disability Discrimination 1995, Section 75. My point being is that discrimination is very specific in law. So people may feel discriminated, but our discriminations are not explicit enough to address those concerns. And I am curious because I genuinely don't know. Is the discrimination described as a principle of this bill? Is it discrimination in law? Or is it Mr Given's interpretation of discrimination? Some of the legislation that has been referred to in respect of this issue, and I don't know if it applies, given that the person being discriminated here is an unborn child. And I would really welcome if any learned members, for example, would intervene to enlighten me. Does our disability discrimination legislation apply to an unborn child? It's something that we're not sure about, so whilst we can point to discrimination, what do we mean by that? And to labour the point around the law, what about women? Is it a form of discrimination to prevent access to public health services that only affect women? Indirect discrimination? I'm not a legally trained barrister or solicitor to consider this law in the way. But this bill does throw up so many uncertainties for me. And if this bill makes its full passage through this House, I do expect to find it within the courts, and then it won't be implemented. So what was the point of this? Mr Speaker, I just want to let the House know that I take this issue very seriously. I spend hours speaking with all sides of this view because it's really important, not least because of my own confliction around abortion. But I just want to say, abortion is not a binary choice of pro-life and pro-choice. It is an incredibly complicated issue in the context of an imperfect world and years of bad governance. Perhaps if we provided better public services, supported women and families, addressed societal attitudes, strengthened communities, and addressed mental health, my goodness, we are a post-conflict society having suffered years of trauma, yet we don't even scratch the surface of mental health. And people are saying that we have to support women more. Maybe that's where we need to start. It's not a choice when society doesn't give you a choice. If we are truly pro-life, then we fix society if we can take this forward. Thank you, Mr Speaker.